Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special recorded interview with author, geology professor, and co-worker from a long time ago, Marcia Bjornerud. Marcia, what's the weather report there in Wisconsin today?
It's appropriately November-ish,
Yeah,
windy, crisp, but sunny.
I love it. I love it. And how long have you been teaching at Lawrence University?
Oof. It has been now almost 30 years since 1995.
Time flies. Okay, well, right at the start, let's make sure everybody knows that you are the author of two of my favorite books, Timefulness, that came out in 2018, and a brand new book that I could not put down. I'm not that kind of a guy. I don't normally just sit and read and read and read, but I think I did this whole book in about three sittings. And by the end, I was a little emotional, and I don't even want to think about that, or I'm going to start again right now. Um, this is who we're talking about and who we're talking to here today. Marcia, you have all sorts of experience dealing with book tours and press, and I think you have an agent and the whole thing right now. Who have you been talking to recently by interview form about this brand new book?
Well, one of the more notable conversations was actually with Alan Alda,
Wow.
that
Okay.
people of a certain age will remember. Um, Perhaps not as well known as he was in our youth, but he has
Yeah.
a long-running podcast called Clear and Vivid, and so I was part of that. And he's really dedicated to science communication in a serious way. But I've talked with people from all kinds of backgrounds,
Yeah.
including psychologists who have realized that in some ways what I'm calling for is a different conception of who we are as humans.
Yes.
um,
Yes.
People in spiritual backgrounds who see some kind of resonance with things that I'm saying, which is, I'm definitely an agnostic, but who see some kind of resonance with spiritual teachings. So I've been pretty open if people are up for a serious conversation to have these far-ranging chats with people who contact me.
Well, you know that there's a wide audience out there and a very diverse audience for this science stuff in general, but specifically our geology world, which has really been a private club for most of our lives, it feels like. And so the internet has just blown the doors open in many ways. And your writing is doing that as well. Is it an accident that we're both doing this sort of thing? Like, or do you feel like there was some influence that you and I had back at the University of Wisconsin, perhaps, that got us going in this direction without even knowing it, perhaps?
I don't think it is an accident, Nick. I know you and I both had Bob Dott, a sedimentologist, but also a historian of geology
Yes.
for several courses each. And I think there was something at the University of Wisconsin in the early 80s that was really, it was a very um, intellectually vibrant time when people were eager to talk across disciplinary boundaries within the geosciences, but the faculty modeled for all of us a certain kind of intellectual curiosity
Hmm.
that I think we both were receptive to.
Well, we both were receptive. I think you were more receptive than I. You were a few years ahead of me. We're basically the same age, but you were always a few years ahead of me, Marcia, in many ways. So I was just getting my footing and just kind of going through the coursework, to be honest. But you had a better feel for what was going on with Cam Craddock and others and grad students in your field work. And I definitely want to talk about your field geology career, your writing a bunch, and your professorship. But I think right now we're back in our common time and place in Madison, Wisconsin. And I go back to like the Wisconsin idea that my dad was always such a huge fan of. We're back to T.C. Chamberlain and stuff like that. And you talked about that in this new book a little bit. What is the Wisconsin idea? And do you think it still exists in some form?
Ooh, I don't think I want to go into the politics in Wisconsin right now, but
Ah, yeah,
yeah, the Wisconsin idea, a really enlightened principle that goes right back to the start of the 20th century, I think was initially articulated by Charles Van Hise, who was one
yeah.
of he was a structural geologist and at some point the president of the University of Wisconsin. And he was a compatriot of Fighting Bob La Follette, who was a big
Yeah.
character in Wisconsin government at the time. And their idea was that the boundaries of the university should be the boundaries of the state.
Oh, I
And
love
so
that.
bringing the products of the university out to remote parts of the state, I think that their idea led to the first so-called extension, the university extension,
Yeah.
which, almost every state now has county extension offices. The extension is part of the university. That's what that means. And 4-H and all of these initiatives kind of emanated from that idea. So it's a kind of utopian idea that knowledge is for the people.
Well, you're bringing back memories of my dad talking fondly about that, including the public radio station that was, I think, right
Mm-hmm.
behind Old Science Hall. And he would talk about growing up on a dairy farm in New Glarus and would hear this, whatever channel that was. And that phrase, I think, was used regularly as a sign off or a call in or whatever. But like that was ingrained mentally into everybody in the state. It feels like that was listening to radio back in the 30s and 40s. So, yeah, it feels very personal. So I don't know. I didn't process that that was that important as a kid in my early 20s, but clearly we're both going beyond the boundary of whatever our universities are. And how did you get into deciding that writing was something that you wanted to do?
Well, I think I've always had a kind of literary proclivity, but
Yes.
to be honest, as a scientist, I really had to kind of set that aside for a long time. Um, and it was really only when I moved from Miami of Ohio, where we both taught for a time, to a small liberal arts college, Lawrence University, where I am now, that I was able to sort of stretch and move out of just writing for other scientists. I'm at a place where different kinds of scholarship are valued. And
Right.
so it's a real privilege to have been able to experiment with that a little. And I think the thing that really got me started was that we have a, a beautiful Scandinavian style lodge that's owned by the university. It's up in Door County, which is the thumb of Wisconsin, sticking out into Lake Michigan. And in the summer, faculty can earn a little extra money by teaching week-long immersive courses.
Hmm.
And so I taught a few up there for ordinary people who were just interested in learning more about the way geologists see the world. And I saw that there really was an appetite, as you've discovered, among ordinary people to understand the landscapes that are around them. And I realized that it is possible to receptive people to delve pretty deeply into
Yes.
fairly, difficult conceptual terrain. And so I started realizing that there's a gap in the published literature between sort of rock and mineral guides and way too much coverage of dinosaurs
Yeah.
and the whole worldview of geology, which is conceptually really subtle.
Well, it is okay to go deeply. I mean, I think that's just an inherent snobbery that many people in our settings have. Like, oh, there's no way that somebody who's an insurance salesman will be able to follow my expertise, and I would take forever to explain everything. Come on, man. And so, yeah, when I tried to talk to my university about doing just free field trips and free public lectures just to get started, there was mostly a blank look on everybody's face. And then one dean said, "Oh, like a Chautauqua." So he knew about this whole upstate New York thing, which I had to look up, I guess. But do you know about those Chautauqua? Is that still happening, the Chautauqua thing?
Mhm. Yeah. And yeah, that's a wonderful model. And that goes way back in, American history.
Right,
This sort of
right.
idea of continuing public education, that it's good for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Well, let's transition if you don't mind. These are the books I'm familiar with. I know you've written a few more, but I've read these so carefully and I hold them so close to my heart. How would you describe your new book compared to this 6-year-old book? I feel like there's so much more of you personally in this new book. Is that an accurate way to portray that book?
Yeah, that's true. I hesitate to call it a memoir,
Yeah.
but it is, I use the framework of my own life and especially my own development as a scientist to welcome people in to this way of thinking that we share. And so, yes, it was a little bit of a challenge for me. I had wanted to write another book after Timefulness that took people deeper into the logic of the solid Earth as a structural geologist. And I want to really convey that the solid Earth is in some way animate, cyborgic almost. And I had a few false starts. It just seemed just too textbooky, I suppose.
Yeah,
And an editor contacted me and said, "Have you ever thought of writing a memoir?" And at first I was really averse to that. I'm a private person. I just thought, ooh, I'm not sure I want to do that. I was concerned about protecting the privacy of my family and people I know who didn't ask to be written about.
yeah,
But then I realized I could use just the bare framework. And again, I think making some of these difficult concepts more accessible by introducing them as they seemed to me at the time that I was encountering them.
right.
So, to that extent, it is a memoir of a kind, but just using my life as a scaffolding.
Well, it just as a reader, I'm going chapter by chapter as I'm taught to do. I start at the beginning of the books. That's just my thing, Marcia. I don't read it backwards. I read from chapter one. And chapter one is called sandstone. Okay, so I'm getting settled in. And chapter two is basalt. And then by chapter three, I'm like, wait a minute, this is kind of a memoir, I think. And we're going kind of chronologically. And now I got to peek to chapter seven or whatever it is when we get to Ohio when I'm working with you. And I'm like, oh my God, what is this? What is going to be in chapter seven? So it was fun to decipher some of the Madison, Wisconsin stuff. And then by the time you get to Miami University, your first teaching job and my first teaching job, we're both not there anymore. So that wasn't my place. And I'm not sure it was your place either, it sounds like. But what do you remember about our days when we were in our late 20s at the beginning of your teaching career in Oxford, Ohio?
Well, I remember everyone saying you were the most virtuosic natural teacher that had ever been at Miami of Ohio.
God, you had to
And being
think.
intimidated by that because I was on the tenure line and very, very stressed actually by being in front of the classroom. Can I
Mhm.
share this photo of us
Oh, sure.
to give people a glimpse? Okay, just
Oh
a
my
second.
God. Oh, thank you for doing your homework. You are an overachiever. Oh my God. Oh, and
So
there
I,
you
I
are.
I show
Yes.
this in part to I am a small person, small in stature, and I was very young. Um,
Yes.
and there was only one other woman on the faculty at the time.
Yeah.
And it was stressful for me, frankly. And as you can see in that picture, I was holding a 1-year-old infant who came to work with me most of the first year of his life.
Hmm.
So I remember those days largely as pretty stressful, actually.
Yes.
And feeling like I had to work 3 times harder than everybody else just to convince them that I belonged there because I just didn't fit the mold in many ways. Um, so even through the rosy spectacles of retrospect, I
Yes.
remember it as actually pretty hard. And I think that's typical of any early tenure track years, but especially in the bad old days, there were some problems in the department that didn't involve either of us. And, frankly, there was just a certain amount of misogyny and yeah. So
Which I was oblivious to. So I mean, it was very interesting and gripping to read your take on that place at that time. What year was that photo? That must have been 1990, maybe 91.
91, I think.
91.
Yeah. And
Okay.
happily, I will say, if there's anybody with a
Yeah.
connection to Miami of Ohio now, I went back a few years ago, right before the pandemic, and gave a talk about timefulness. And I was
Yeah.
just very pleased to see that the department is thriving. It was kind of a shock that there were only a couple of people who still were there from my time. It was a complete
Yeah.
generational change.
Yeah.
And they're in a renovated building. They have a wonderful museum. And so, yeah. But
Well,
I think
yeah.
one thing that I learned during that time was to and even as a student, was to kind of look in on the geosciences as a discipline from the outside, almost as an anthropologist studying the discipline, because I felt like an outsider. And to some extent, I think that's become helpful in my writing because I can see it somewhat from the outside, even though I'm also on the inside.
If you don't mind, can we talk more about that? That's a surprise to me. Like you were on the fast track, you were doing all the right things, doing all the grant proposals, the PhD, everything. What do you think? Why did you feel like an outsider most of the time?
Well, mainly just, as one of the few women in my field at that time.
I
I
see.
hadn't had any mentors. I got a lot
Uh,
of mixed signals, frankly, in grad school, even about whether I would have a viable career in academia, and just really lacked the self-confidence. So, it was partly my own
hmm.
self-doubt that caused me to feel that way, I guess.
Well, you mentioned intimidation. I was intimidated by you when we were working together. I mean, you just felt like you were miles ahead of me, and I was literally in the basement and just starting to learn how to teach, and was walked down the hall to the auditorium in the basement as well. So, I learned my chops then and was doing really a totally different job than you. But Liz and I left shortly after that photo was taken because we missed the West. Why did you leave Miami and head back to Wisconsin where you grew up?
It was probably mostly personal reasons. My family is from Wisconsin, like yours, and climate reasons. I never
Yeah,
really realized that there wasn't winter in Southern Ohio. So I'm a cross country skier and I wanted my kids to grow up knowing snowy winters.
yeah.
Um, so a combination of things, and the prospect of teaching at a small liberal arts college was attractive to it was hard trying to attract graduate students in structural geology in Southern Ohio, where flat-lying dolomite stretches to the horizon.
Right.
So, yeah, we've got great rocks. People may not realize that Wisconsin is really geodiverse. Up in the northern part of the state and in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, we have some really complicated old rocks, and hardly anybody's studying them from the University of Wisconsin these days. So we have just sort of wonderful stuff in our backyard to put undergraduates on, and yeah, lots of things that haven't really been looked at since the late 1800s.
No kidding. Okay,
Yeah.
well that's pretty wild. I do want to eventually head to one of your chapters in this new book called Turbidite and get into arcosic sandstones and things that we've been working on with this current series I'm doing, but I don't think we're there quite yet. So, your first decade at Lawrence, you've left Miami of Ohio. Now you've got this job back home. Is it mostly a teaching gig, or are you trying to attract students and go out and do field work like you were describing so much in the book?
Well, it's an undergraduate only institution. So,
Okay.
yeah, we don't have even a master's program. Um, and it's primarily teaching, but
Yeah.
we do have an expectation all students complete some sort of senior experience project. And in the geosciences, that's generally meant some kind of field lab combined project. And when I can get people interested in hard rock geology, there's plenty, as I said, for them to sink their teeth into. Really
Yeah.
complicated old rocks. We've got several mountain belts that grew here. We have one of the best exposed ancient rift zones. We've got this one of the most exciting things in Lake Superior geology in the last 15 years is the discovery of the Sudbury ejecta layer. Sudbury crater is the second largest known crater on Earth, bigger than the Chicxulub crater. And no one had
Wow.
thought to look for the ejecta until a couple of high school teachers from Thunder Bay, Ontario said, "Hey, geologists, has anybody looked for this ejecta layer?" And by looking at detrital zircons in banded iron formation and narrowing down where in the banded iron formation we should be looking, because the age of the crater was well known, lo and behold, now that ejecta layer has been found all along the north and southern shores of Lake Superior. That's one
Huh.
day, 1.85 billion years ago, that we can say that was that bad day.
No
And so,
kidding.
yeah. So this is extreme geology. And so, I've had a lot of students on the hunt with me for that ejecta layer in various places in the UP and Wisconsin.
Well, that's the
So
next book, isn't
I think somebody should write a book about
it?
that whole
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Maybe not me, but
Right. Okay. Um, the timefulness book is just like it sounds. It sounds like that was the emphasis to be, well, you can put it in your own words, but the emphasis here was going, as you said early on, the early draft of this was almost like a textbook. Why were you picking those certain rock types? Was that the approach before you decided to put some of your personal history into the book, or did it work vice versa?
yeah, it's hard to remember what the book was before now.
Yeah.
I, I guess I was trying to really take people into the physiology of the planet, how extraordinary it is that subduction happens. I mean,
Hmm.
if we think about this, we talk about it all the time, but to me, one of the most extraordinary things about the process of subduction is that it is a way that the atmosphere hydrosphere system remains connected to the deep interior of the Earth. Because when the
Hmm.
subducting slab goes down into the mantle, it's carrying a lot of water, both physically bound, but also chemically bound up in minerals. And that water, in turn, recharges the mantle and reduces the viscosity of the mantle and keeps the mantle convecting. At this point in Earth's history, if there wasn't water, there's probably an ocean's worth of water in the mantle thanks to subduction. If the water wasn't there, probably the mantle would be too cold and too viscous to continue to convect, and we would no longer have plate tectonics.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's mind blowing. Even
Yeah.
more so is that subduction depends on the conversion of basalt, which makes up the crustal part of the downgoing slab, of course, to a much denser garnet rich rock called eclogite that is denser than the ambient upper mantle. That's amazing because basalt is derived from the mantle, but then when it gets down to a significant enough depth, the feldspars and all the aluminum in them reconfigure into garnet, which is really dense and dense enough to sink through the mantle.
Hmm.
So, I mean, there's some just extraordinary things about the way the solid Earth works that I wanted to convey, that it's not just about the past. This is how this planet functions and
Yeah.
how all of these systems are interacting with each other. So I chose these rocks as kind of exemplars of different organs, I suppose, in the
Yeah.
Earth. And collectively, I hope people come away with this extraordinary sense that this is in some way a living planet. Even the solid part of it, the tectonic system itself is um, animate. Yeah.
You're good. You've got practice communicating this. I mean, I
I
don't know if
gesture
Alan,
wildly. Yes.
no, if Alan Alda got you going on that as well, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to keep up with Alan Alda at this point. But I mean, you have your talking points, but you have experience and the enthusiasm comes through, and all that repetition in your classroom allows you to just flow and go. And I don't think either of us had that 30 years ago. Like we're just mechanically trying to get through chapter 12, you know, it's like you don't have any personality at all. At least I'm talking about myself. So it's fun to talk to you now after all this experience. Let's go, if you wouldn't mind, to your turbidite chapter. And selfishly, I am really puzzled right now about all this melange that we have in Western Washington. That's the basement underneath the South Cascades of Washington. I don't know what the hell to do with that stuff. And nobody seems to have any sort of general tectonic story for why you would have this chaotic mixture of gabbro, gneiss, chert that's Permian with this matrix of arcosic sandstone with no bedding, essentially. Everything's all screwed up on different scales as well. In your chapter of turbidites, you're talking about arcosic sandstones, you're talking about fleisch, you're talking about melange, you're talking about gray wacky. Can you just, at least from your chapter and your experience as a field geologist, what do these things look like? And do you think they have anything to do with what I'm just describing out here in Washington?
Yeah, I dipped a little bit into some of the papers you recommended about the Wisconsin or the Western Melange Belt, and I agree, it's a strange critter. We could talk about that. So yeah,
Yeah.
turbidites, I find fascinating from a number of perspectives. Again, history of geology. I don't know if you've talked with people about how it was discovered, how they form. They're an amazing case where people had mapped these repetitively bedded rock sequences in almost all the mountain belts in the world, the Alps, the Appalachians, the Scottish Caledonites, but they didn't know how they formed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so the characteristic look of turbidites is they're they're repetitive between maybe 10 centimeters and meter thick beds that just are repeating over and over, and they're often graded, meaning they start with coarser materials at the base and then fine upward. So they can range from conglomerates actually at the base to coarse sand, or from sand to siltstone or even slate or shale. But they have this repetitive nature, and it wasn't discovered until I think it was 1929, a great earthquake off the coast of Newfoundland that clipped submarine telegraph cables in quick succession, and they realized something fast was moving at great depth across the ocean floor, and they figured out that it was these great slurries of sediment that moved with much energy and transported huge amounts of continentally derived sediment out onto the seafloor. And the
But
only
they're
reason,
but they're
go
well
ahead.
behaved. They're well behaved. The stratigraphy is there, right? It's
Hmm.
not. That's comforting at this point. I'm just dying for something like that in
But we
any of
only
the
see
cities.
them when they're, shoved up onto continents in mountain building episodes. So they're not so
Right.
well behaved. They're
Okay.
reshelved and faulted and messed up to some extent.
Right.
So we see these in great accretionary prisms, which, you have one just off the coast of Washington and Oregon. The Great Cascadia Wedge is a modern one forming now as these deep sea sediments get scraped off the bottom of a subducting plate. And they can have other things in them. So the ones I was studying up in northern Ellesmere Island in Arctic Canada had some carbonate rocks and some volcanic rocks that we interpreted as huge avalanches essentially into the deep basin, probably from an island arc complex with a fringing coral reef or something.
Huh.
And so there were big chunks. None of them were the scale that some of those huge knockers in the Melange Belt are. As I understand, some of those are like kilometer scale.
Yes. Yes.
These, yeah, we would see things that were maybe at the outside tens of meters in
Hmm.
size.
Hmm.
And then the other exotic rock that we found in this ancient accretionary wedge in Ellesmere were serpentinites. And they are products of the hydration of ultramafic rocks like peridotite, which is the main rock of the mantle. And we interpreted them as actually being intrusive into the turbidites. So this seems very strange. Serpentinite is a metamorphic rock formed from an igneous rock, but there are places on Earth today, especially the forearc in front of the Mariana Trench, so the
Okay.
area between the trench and the Mariana Islands, which are an island arc, where as ocean crust is being subducted, it's dewatering and it's hydrating the overlying mantle of the overriding plate, turning it to
Okay.
serpentinite.
Yeah.
Serpentinite is kind of like rock salt in that it can flow in the solid state at very low temperature, and it's quite low density compared with peridotite for sure, because it's a hydrated version of peridotite, and it can actually intrude and even extrude onto the ocean floor.
Really.
And there are serpentinite seamounts in the Mariana Forearc that we think were analogs to what we were seeing in the this ancient Silurian age accretionary prism. So
Wow.
as far as the Western Melange belt, it's not too surprising to see peridotite, serpentinite, lots of continentally derived sediment, maybe the occasional carbonate coming down. But what really puzzles me are the gneisses.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
are not oceanic in
Right.
any conceivable way. Or
Right.
I think somebody mentioned tonalites, which are fairly
Yeah.
felsic
Yeah.
igneous rocks. Those are very hard to explain. And I guess I was going to ask you, has anybody looked at the zircons in those rocks and tried to link them back with anything in North America? Where are they coming from?
Well, I'm into that right now. Like I did that thing that you saw on Saturday morning, and it's been fun. I have people that I can call on, literally text or email, and ask them to watch an episode and then react. So yeah, there's some detrital zircons in that melange belt. There's one that's like more than 3 billion years old, sitting in this matrix of this unit. There's others that are just generally garden variety Precambrian detrital zircons, maybe from the Lemhi Basin in Idaho. I mean, I did a Baja, BC series a couple winters ago, and there was those detrital zircons were contentious to say the least, up in the Nanaimo group and everything else. So I mean, this can get away from me in a hurry. Like I want to stay with the Cascades, and I think I'm just doing one more episode with this melange unit as the basement to the South Cascades. But I mean, I think there's even people talking about the Western Melange Belt as being a continuation of the Franciscan down in
Yeah, that's what it
California.
sounds like. But that does not have some of these continental rock types, as far as I know. But I
Right.
was wondering if anybody had compared the detrital zircons in the matrix with zircons that may be in some of these huge clasts of
Oh,
gneiss and tonalite. That would be really interesting. If they're coming from the same source, then those huge clasts or whatever you want to call them are coming potentially from above. But it did occur to me if they're not and they're continental, I mean, the only other mechanism would be subduction erosion, which is
yeah,
actually, it's kind of the opposite of accretion. It's where, especially in flat slab subduction, um, you're actually scraping stuff off the bottom of the overriding continental plate.
the
And
bottom.
then, yeah, so it's being removed and then being incorporated into the subduction channel.
Wow.
It's the only other way potentially for continental crust to get recycled if that stuff gets dragged down into the mantle. But in this case, it didn't because it's still with us. But
Huh.
yeah, I'm really puzzled by felsic and metamorphic rocks
Right.
being,
Yeah. Well,
not blue schist, but gneisses. This has got to be continental crust. So how is that getting mashed in? That's really weird.
I mean, the only thing I can think of, just riffing off of what you're saying, and it's this. These are fascinating concepts to think about, and you do it so effortlessly. Thank you. Is that potentially this is far traveled material, like it's accreted to the edge of North America, but it's being translated 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers to the north, and so perhaps you're entraining certain things, and you're shaving off slivers of tonalites, and you get it into a melange post accretion, and I'm going to stop because I don't really know what I'm talking about. But there's elaborate scenarios that I think are possible of this unit, and it's typically been overlooked by just except for just a handful of people. And of course, we can say that about most things, right? Like how much work has, let's go back to the book as we finish up here. You were up in Svalbard studying under Cam Craddock, I assume, went back a few years. That was fascinating to read about your experiences being dropped off in your life as an isolated field geologist with just a couple of buddies for the whole summer. Buddies is maybe the wrong word. Um, what was the scope of that project? And do you think anybody's picked up on that work in the last 30 years?
Yeah, so my PhD work was up in Svalbard, and at the time we were really doing some of the first mapping, detailed mapping of the northernmost extension of the Caledonian mountain belt, which is, part of the Appalachians, essentially continuing up into Europe. And so it was very basic field geology. There aren't too many places on Earth anymore that
Yes.
hadn't been mapped. So I actually got to name stratigraphic units and had to have them approved by the International Commission on Stratigraphy and things. But I was focusing on the structural history of the northern Caledonites. Then I did go back to that area more than 20 years later because the rocks there included some pretty amazing exposures of snowball earth age diamictites. So about 700 to 630 million year old ancient glacial deposits and glacial-marine deposits that are now recognized as part of a very deep, long ice age, much more severe than the one we're still emerging from in the Pleistocene. So I went back with kind of new eyes and tried to read the stratigraphic story of those rocks. And people actually have now picked up my old PhD work, and it's gratifying that most of it was probably accurate, but there are certainly
Okay,
many new analytical methods that have come online that have fine-tuned the work that we did. But we posed some good questions, and that's really heartening to know that it did contribute to the understanding of that region.
nice. Hey, let's finish with this. You can pass if you want, but let's just finish with this. How have you evolved as a instructor in a classroom and as a writer over the last 30 years? I don't know if you were doing any writing for a general audience back in Miami or whatever, but like I'm working with a brand new early career woman right now, Hannah Shamlou, and I talk about her all the time in this project. And she's stressed and she's got a lot on her plate, and she feels like she's just working nonstop just to kind of earn her keep. And she's very talented, but it might be helpful to hear about your growth, because those early days were stressful, and maybe I don't know if you got close to quitting it at any point with academia, but how have you evolved and kind of thrown more and more of your personality into both your writing and your teaching?
Well, I think I've been able to zoom out a little bit and realize what really matters. So I think, like you, something you said earlier, teaching, we got to get through chapter 12, whatever. I used to think I had to cover everything.
Yes,
And at some point, realizing, that does not matter. It's the habits of mind. It's the conceptual framework that is more important than any particular content. So I think I've allowed myself to relax a little bit, to prioritize what people who are not necessarily going into geology will take with them into their lives as earthlings, as I like to say,
yeah,
as citizens of this planet. And certainly at the same time that I've changed, our understanding of our collective impact on the planet has changed. And so my priorities have also, become more aligned with getting people to wake up to the reality of the Anthropocene and the looming fact of climate change and what it's going to mean for us. So I think I've allowed myself to teach less, but to
yeah,
teach in a deeper and more humanistic way.
same. And how about your writing?
Well, I was involved. I don't know if I did it when you were still at Miami of Ohio, but we were revamping the intro labs at the
Yep.
time. And as the young, untenured faculty member, I was charged with rethinking the labs, which were taught by grad students. And I did develop an internal lab book that organized the labs around themes of Earth systems rather than sort of the rocks in boxes approach, which has been used forever. And that lab book did evolve actually into a published book. It wasn't something that someone would sit down and read for pleasure, but that was my first foray into kind of um, trying to conceive of these Earth systems in a way that the average person might care. And
Yes.
so that was the beginning. But then, three children, having to get tenure again, moving our department twice here, and just life caused a little bit of an unconformity in my writing life.
Have you been pleased with the reaction to your books? It feels good when you put something out there and people respond, whether it's by email or some of these book events that you've had. It must feel good, right?
It does. I'm not on social media. I'm not like you, Nick, being so energetic, and I got other stuff to do.
Yeah,
But people find me, and it's really truly touching that people write at length, send me rocks.
right.
um yeah, it really it makes me feel that it matters, and that's really why I write. I mean, I like you, kind of a geo evangelist, and I just think we'd all be better off if we understood better this place we're living.
Two more quick things and then we're done, I promise. can you comment on being a woman in geology and the growth or changes that you've seen over the last 35 years?
Yeah, these days, I don't know if it's true on your campus, but more than half our students and half our geo majors are women.
Yep.
And it is really, really heartening to see how the demographics of the field have changed. I think we still have a long way to go in making the field more diverse in other ways, but the gender disparity is nothing like it was when I was a grad student, and the attitudes are much more enlightened. So, hallelujah for that.
Yes. Um, I have a special request. If I read it, I'm going to cry, but I love page 276. Do you have one handy? Would you mind reading?
Okay, you know what? I don't have a copy of the book here, but I've got it on my computer.
Thank you. I'll pause.
It
I'll stall for you for a second. Thank you for doing this. This is the end of the quartzite chapter, and we are kind of wrapping up. And this is before the epilogue on beach stones. But Bob Dott, who was brought up at the very beginning of this little chat, I'd like to close with him. And um, if you can find it, maybe starting on the middle of 275 and going over to the middle of 276. I just thought I was so emotional reading that, and it was just so beautifully written. And for those that have never even met Robert Dott, I think they might be able to feel the power of your writing here. So if you wouldn't mind.
Not at all. You might want to pause because I need to find the file.
Oh God.
Um,
Okay.
yeah. Okay. I think I got it.
275, like
Okay.
I call out to the students that will need to leave soon.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't expecting. Um, yeah, sorry. Okay, I tried opening it one way. I got to open it a different way.
Okay. All right. This is worth the wait. My God, this it's all coming back. I wouldn't say we were
Hmm.
close necessarily, Marcia, when we were there together in Ohio, but it's just so fun and warm to be with you again. This is really
I
time
know
travel
it
here
feels
for
like
sure.
falling into old times. So
Yes.
yeah, again, sorry. I've got way too there. There we go. Yes, one more file. A lot of versions of the book.
Apparently, yes.
Well, I opened it in Word and it was a PDF, and so that took too much time. Okay,
Okay.
so 270.
Yeah, 275 into 276, just two or three paragraphs where we're talking about Bob and that quartzite outcrop on US Highway
Ah,
12.
yes. Okay, so here we go. For many years, this outcrop was a hazardous place to stop, just off the side of US Highway 12. Coming from the south, the highway was ramrod straight where it passed the Badger ammunition plant, curved gently as it climbed up the flank of the Baraboo Hills, and then, just past the summit, veered sharply around the Point of Rocks promontory. In the early 2000s, as part of a larger highway improvement project, the U.S. Department of Transportation announced plans to take the kink out of the road and blast the outcrop away. My students gasp, and I nod grimly in agreement. Geologists from all over the country were outraged. This was a place of pilgrimage. After 1.5 billion years, was this to be the undignified demise of those sublime ripple marks? Led by Bob Dott, the connoisseur of quartz and one of my own mentors at the University of Wisconsin, then in his 80s, scores of us lobbied to have the outcrop spared. Ultimately, an overpass was built, removing the dangerous bend in the highway and preserving Point of Rocks on a quiet cul-de-sac below. Among the sadnesses of growing older is losing one's mentors, then inexorably one's peers, people who share memories of earlier versions of the world. But the Baraboo quartzite reminds us that they're with us in all the old familiar places. They're present when we immerse ourselves in secular ritual, on a spring visit to an outcrop, in the daily routine of classes, in the arc of another academic year, the seasons of a career, the slow overturn of the generations.
Thank you, Marcia. Hang on for just a sec. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick.